computer. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lamazzo, who's going to introduce Dr. Hutton. So Dr. Lamazzo, why don't you take it from here?
Hello, everybody. Good evening. I would like I know Tom since my training. I trained at the University of Minnesota, and Tom was, I find now, 2 years ahead of me, and left in '78. I left in 1980. It seems like an ancient time. And Tom was always the smart guy who had gone to Russia. Tom trained in Russia with a very famous, world famous neurologist, a behavioral neurologist called by the name of Alexander Luria. And he knew things about the brain that nobody else knew and still don't know, probably. Tom could tell you in a minute what kind of aphasia John Futterman has, or all kinds of other neurological things. So anyway, we have a common interest in historical neurology, and Tom was the one that pioneered the whole notion of Hitler having Parkinson's disease. So from this point on, I'm going to give it to Tom, who is one of my old friend, and he's going to give a very, very interesting talk. Thank you.
Well, Steve, thank you. I really appreciate your introduction, and it is so good to see you again after so many years. I really appreciate being invited to speak to the New Jersey World War II book club, the round table, and appreciate working with Rich. He's made it very easy for me. I'm really delighted to be here and discuss my most recent book, which is Hitler's Maladies and Their Impact on World War II. For some reason, it's not.
Oh, I was going to say, we just lost your video. Escape. Hit escape. It's not advancing. Is that the problem?
It's not escaping.
Yeah, so hit escape for a minute, or what'd you do?
You just canceled.
All right. Now hit.
Excuse me just a minute. Sorry for the technical problem.
Oh, that's okay. It's screen share again.
Been having a little trouble with my computer today, so that
can be finicky.
yes.
So once you do the screen share, there you go.
Right.
Now hit slideshow on the very top menu bar. Yep, that, and then start from beginning. Here, play right here. Play from start. And once you hit play from start, no, you didn't hit play from start.
I'm gonna get there.
There. Okay. Now it should advance one by one when you click.
There it is.
There you go.
Very good.
You're off and running.
Okay.
First one.
Thank you. I thought what I would begin the talk tonight by describing what I see as some catastrophic errors that Adolf Hitler committed. Some of the big questions that exist in the minds of historians still are: why did Hitler invade the USSR prematurely in 1941? Why was Hitler so slow to respond at Normandy in June of 1944? And third, why was Hitler mentally inflexible and so disregarding of his general staff toward the conclusion of World War II at the Battle of the Bulge? These are three historical markers that we'll be referring to. Now, historians have argued these questions, of course, for decades, and there's some very good reasons that have been brought up. But however, I think relatively little attention has been paid to integrating Hitler's poor mental and physical health into his decision-making, into his catastrophic errors. We now know that Adolf Hitler, and we'll be presenting more information as we go along, he suffered from Parkinson's disease. He suffered from coronary artery disease. He had various gastrointestinal maladies that particularly of concerning during Operation Barbarossa. And also better known is his excessive drug usage. And all of these problems, I think, come to bear when talking about his catastrophic errors. At the conclusion of this, I'll see if you agree with me that his health plays a role in addition to various political, economic reasons. What I will attempt to do in the next 45 minutes or so is to integrate his physical and mental health into these three decisive battles of World War II, and I think they perhaps help us to explain his errors. Also, let me begin by just sharing the purpose of the book itself. And I can do no better than just to read from the preface. Describing the sizable impact of Adolf Hitler's poor health and the desperate circumstances that existed in Germany following World War I represents the guiding light for writing this book. Much of the important information about Der Führer currently resides in turgid historical tomes or psychologically related articles that prove confusing and off-putting for many readers. Nevertheless, the impact of Hitler's physical and mental health on his conduct, especially during the latter phases of World War II, has relevance for a popular audience. Well, of course, there is young Adolf as an infant. It's hard to imagine angelic, blue-eyed child like that giving rise to the terror and the deaths of over 55 million people. For some reason, it doesn't want to advance once again. I'm going to have to stop this again to see if we can.
I was going to say, are you using your mouse to click to advance or your arrow keys?
I was using the arrow keys.
You could also try a click of your mouse, see if that does it better.
Okay.
Screen share, and then hit the PowerPoint up, slideshow, and then, yep, then it should be good. And start, of course. Does clicking it help? There you go.
Yes, I think so. I'll do that instead. It seems to work better.
Okay.
I'll read a brief passage on the birth and his birthplace from the book. As the sun descended toward the dark part of Saturday, April 20, 1889, a little noted event occurred that ultimately impacted the entire world. For at that time, Adolphus Hitler, as his name on the birth certificate was listed, was born at Salzburger Vorstadt 15 in Braunau am Inn. No one could have predicted that the angelic blue-eyed infant would one day become the most hated man in history, or bring about the death of over 50 million persons. This is a picture of Braunau am Inn. It is now about 20,000 population. It's only about 10,000 when Adolf Hitler was born there. It's a very bucolic environment. It's located very near the Bavarian border, where Adolf's father, on the right, served as a minor customs official. At the time of Adolf's birth, Alois Sr. was 52 years old. He was very doctrinaire, very strict, very disciplined man, who was also an alcoholic and was abusive of Adolf and his half-brother Alois Jr. On the left is his mother. Clara was only 29 at the time Adolf was born. Clara has an interesting history. She came into the Hitler household as a servant. About that time, Fanny, Alois Sr.'s second wife, developed tuberculosis, and Clara began to treat her and deal with her as a nursemaid. Ultimately, Fanny died. Alois, meanwhile, had taken Clara as his mistress, and about 9 months later, Clara gave rise to Gustav, their first child. Interesting that in Mein Kampf, Adolf said that he respected his father, but he loved his mother. And I think that says a lot about the relationship that he had with his parents. Curiously, Alois Sr. and Clara were second cousins, and it took a special dispensation from the Catholic Church for them even to marry. So that Alois very much wanted a mother for his children, and started the family just a little early. One of the stories that comes down to us that says quite a bit about Adolf's personality, I think, is called the Toga Boy story. This story actually was passed through by Hitler's foreign secretary, Putzi Hofstengel. And the story goes something like this. According to Alice Miller, who shares this story, it encapsulates the humiliation young Adolf suffered from his overbearing and authoritarian father. Because of many frustrations and arguments with his father, by the way, most of which dealt with Adolf wanting to be a visual artist and his father wanting him to be a customs official like himself. Anyway, Alois learned that Adolf was trying to run away from home. Alois learned of his son's plans to sneak off and thwarted them by locking Adolf in an upstairs room that had bars across the window. The rebellious, slender Adolf tried to escape by wriggling between the bars and the window. He found the opening between the bars barely too small to squirm through, so Adolf backed off, removed his clothing, and reattempted his escape. It was during this act of squirming naked through the bars that Adolf heard his father's heavy bootsteps ominously ascending the narrow wooden stairway. Adolf quickly aborted his attempted escape, jumped to the floor, and hastily covered his nakedness with an available tablecloth. On entering the room and seeing his son with a tablecloth wrapped around him, toga style, Alois threw back his head and guffawed at his son's ridiculous appearance. Rather than whipping the boy, he determined to humiliate him. Alois called for Clara, and in front of the wife further ridiculed the silly toga-like appearance of their son. This actually, Adolf would have preferred rather to have been whipped and beaten as he typically was, but this humiliation caused a great deal of pent-up emotion, and it was years later that Adolf said before he could get over this humiliating event. In the book, we go through quite a variety of instances that show Adolf's troubled personality. He had trouble in school. He had trouble forming friendships. He was beaten. His father was alcoholic. There's a whole host of reasons for why he developed such an unusual personality. And in fact, many psychiatrists, psychologists, and psychoanalysts have looked at his personality and find that there's really no clearly definable single personality disorder, but several personality disorders that are mixed together. For example, he was quite narcissistic, which really is a person holds an inflated sense of their self-importance. And a narcissist needs and seeks attention. Adolf, from his youth, was quite grandiose, and he was always trying to do things well beyond what was really feasible. This, of course, is present later in his life. He was antisocial. He was sociopathic, psychopathic, which basically is a disregard for other people and with regard to their rights and their feelings for others. He was a borderline personality. This is kind of in between a psychosis and a neurosis. It refers to emotional instability, feelings of worthlessness, impulsivity, and impaired social relationships, all of which were quite obvious later in his life. Edward Hemer was one of his principal teachers, and he wrote a very revealing student evaluation in which he described Adolf's stubbornness, his inconsiderateness, his self-righteousness, and tendency toward rage. And all of those, of course, became quite apparent later in life. At the same time, he commented on his ability as an artist and thought he had talent. In 1904, Adolf was actually kicked out of real schooling. That is, he did not graduate from what we would recognize as high school. And yet in 1905, he took off for Vienna because he had the strong desire to become a visual artist. And he was in Vienna from 1905 to 1914. He applied for admittance to the Vienna Academy of Arts in both 1907 and 1908, but in both instances, his admission was refused, and it was said it was for unfitness for painting. The admissions committee recommended he apply for the School of Architecture that was also in Vienna, but lacking a high school degree and various prerequisites, he could not even make application. Adolf, in Mein Kampf, described his situation in Vienna as most unhappy. He was quite poor. It was in Vienna that for the first time he ran into a large number of Jewish people, and Adolf felt threatened by them. Some of these people were being admitted to the Academy of Arts, for which he had been refused. Adolf lost both parents during his time that he was in Vienna. He lived a very humble lifestyle. He was very poor. He worked in a variety of odd jobs, including working in construction. There was one story that actually told upon himself that others have told, where some of his fellow workers threatened to push him off of the scaffolding. It was obvious he wasn't very popular with his other workers because he had a tendency to give lectures to them, was prudish, and wasn't very well liked. In 1914, he jumped at the opportunity to join a Bavarian regiment. Recall that he's Austrian, but he refused to join an Austrian regiment. Instead, went across the border and joined a Bavarian regiment known as the List Regiment. And here he is. If you can spot him here, he's on the left front row with some of his comrades. He's sporting at the time a Kaiser Wilhelm II mustache. This was very popular in the day, and this was his first mustache. And some people have wondered why he shaved it off. Well, you can look at the gas mask that they were encouraged to wear, and there's no way that luxuriant mustache would fit under the gas mask. So the soldiers were told they had to chop them off, and it gave rise to the more famous toothbrush mustache that he sported for the rest of his life. Adolf Hitler only rose to the rank of corporal, which I'm told is pretty equal to private first class in our army. And it was said that he lacked leadership ability. I found that an interesting statement, and perhaps one of the greatest understatements of the war. He ran messages between headquarters and front lines. He was brave. He won 2 Iron Crosses, 1 first class, 1 second class. And actually, by being a courier, he saw more of the war than most of the German soldiers. He had some feeling for the strategy, what was going on in various sectors, and perhaps he had a better understanding than the typical private or corporal in the German army. While in the service of the German army, he became an ultranationalist. He hearkened back to the days of a greater Germany that included more than the Germany that existed at the time, that included Austria, for example. And he developed a sense of belonging to something larger than himself, keeping in mind now he was an orphan at this point, and he was feeling very much lost about what he was going to do for the rest of his life. And he wanted to stay in the army. While there, he developed also great animosity for those who ultimately surrendered Germany to the Allies. And I think we're all familiar with the notion of the stab in the back, which became quite a political slogan. At the conclusion of World War I, Adolf really had no place to go. He was parentless. He had no job. He had to go back to Munich to get mustered out of the List Regiment. And I'd just like to read a passage from the book that describes what Munich was like right after World War I. At the time, Christianity was under assault. It had always been the prevailing force that provided meaning to the lives of people. Science and pseudoscience held increasing sway, and people struggled to find meaning in their difficult industrialized lives. Open class warfare existed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was imploding, and a flood of refugees sought sanctuary in Western Europe. These immigrant migrations caused additional cultural friction and societal confusion. Also, the onset of the Great Depression further battered world economies, causing still greater personal suffering and deprivation in a defeated Germany. Germany suffered substantially because of its loans being recalled by the United States. It was in this chaos and societal suffering that the mature Adolf Hitler first strode upon the world stage. Adolf needed a job. He actually first went to work in Munich for the Weimar government, which was a bourgeois government, but it was a socialist government, and that appealed to Adolf. And his job was to act as a spy, essentially, on the various political groups that were fomenting possible revolution around Germany. In 1919, he was asked to investigate the German Workers' Party, whose platform actually appealed to Adolf. It called for removal of class structure, creation of a pan-German state. It denied citizenship to Jews, or called for that, and was quite hostile to the Treaty of Versailles. All of these planks in the platform really appealed to Adolf Hitler. After a while, he stopped submitting his reports on the German Workers' Party, and about that time, the Workers' Party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or what we know as the Nazi Party. All of this is probably a review for the vast majority of people who are listening tonight, but I think that this is important to have some understanding because this formed his behavior later on. While he was working with the Nazi Party, he showed demonstrable organizational abilities. He was a great recruiter, and his oratory grew, and with that, he rose rapidly within the Nazi Party. As you know, he held many of his rallies in beer halls around Munich, and here's a picture of just one of them in 1923. Now let's pass on from that brief review of what was going on in Germany to his illnesses, and then we'll come back and try to apply that to the major battles that I mentioned. Adolf Hitler had hypertension and coronary artery disease. We'll talk about that at some length. He suffered Parkinson's disease. He suffered gastrointestinal complaints all of his life, but particularly during a vital part of Operation Barbarossa, developed dysentery and then a gallbladder attack that we will talk about. And finally, he had excessive drug use, including barbiturates, methamphetamines, OxyContin, and cocaine. What a toxic stew that is. Adolf Hitler had a fluctuating moderate high blood pressure. We don't really know the onset of that when Dr. Theodore Morell joined the staff in 1936. He documented it. Almost certainly it existed before. Also, Hitler had onset of exercise-induced angina pectoris, and that had begun probably a couple of years earlier because he had talked about it earlier. And this he referred to as a weak heart when he tried to climb up the mountains from the Berghof. He would have chest pain that would cause him to stop and get short of breath and have to stop. In retrospect, I think it's pretty clear that he had angina pectoris due to coronary artery disease. And we now know that the life expectancy with coronary artery disease in the 1930s and 1940s was only about 8 to 9 years. So these, beginning in about 1933, 1934, become relevant. I'd like to read a section, a very brief passage, which I think gives a very nice description of Adolf Hitler's angina pectoris. Apparently, von Ribbentrop had summoned the audacity to question Hitler's wisdom in attacking the Soviet Union several months before. This occurred in August of 1941. Soviet Union, a country that possessed far greater resources in both men and war-making abilities than did Germany. In addition, Ribbentrop had negotiated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 and felt personal qualms about breaking the treaty by attacking a former ally. Questioning the decision of a narcissist predictably brought forth an emotional outburst from Hitler. Observers of the event described Hitler at first being thunderstruck by Ribbentrop's effrontery for having broached the impertinent topic, then for having questioned the advisability of Hitler's decision. The color in Hitler's face drained such that he became pale. Hitler collapsed backward, falling into a chair while clutching his chest. After a short time, the color returned to Hitler's face. Hitler said, "Don't ever question any of my orders again." He said this in a quiet voice while recovering from the chest pain. He then continued, "I think I'm having a heart attack." I don't think you can have a much better description of the angina pectoris attack than that. This is actually a picture taken of Molotov and von Ribbentrop when they signed the Non-Aggression Pact in 1939. Additional evidence of Hitler's heart disease can be taken from a series of EKGs. And the first EKG was prompted by that anginal attack that I just read to you. There was a series of about 4. It was rather tough to do in those days. It was more like a stress test, but you may be able to see some ST wave changes throughout. And this also progressed then throughout the years with worsening of his EKGs. We now, of course, know that coronary artery disease is caused by plaque, largely cholesterol-containing plaques that increases. The coronary arteries carry oxygenated blood to the myocardium, to the heart muscles, and at some point, the vessel may completely plug up, or it may break off with small blood clots called emboli and give rise to heart attacks. We have a number of treatments today, of course, for coronary artery disease. Statins are well known. They lower cholesterol, reduce the amount of plaque that's present, reduce the risk of heart attack by about 25%. Beta blockers actually have a double punch. They not only lower the blood pressure, which is good, but they also reduce the heart rate, which means the heart doesn't require as much oxygenated blood. Blood thinners are sometimes used, or antiplatelet agents to keep clots from forming. None of those were available in the 1930s or 1940s. The only thing available were lifestyle changes. And we still use those these days. Healthier habits, improving diet. Hitler actually was virtually a vegetarian. So reducing meat was really not going to help because he already had done so. He exercised a fair amount by walking his dog Blondie. He was advised to give up smoking by the man who interpreted his EKGs, but Hitler never smoked. So that there really was very little that could be done by Morell or anyone else for Hitler's coronary artery disease. Let's pass on to talk about his Parkinson's disease. He began to show some diminished arm swing in the videotapes that were taken in 1933 and 1934. This is often the very first sign of idiopathic Parkinson's disease. Also in 1934, he had the onset of very small handwriting. It's called micrographia, and I'll show you an example of that in just a minute. Later, he developed all the cardinal signs of Parkinson's, including the 3 to 5 cycle per second slow resting hand tremor, the slowness of his overall movements called bradykinesia, the rather blank staring face that is so typical for Parkinson's disease, changes in the voice quality with it becoming hoarse, becoming low volume, and also the stooped posture that he developed as well. So he had all the cardinal signs, but we can probably date the onset quite a bit earlier than waiting for all the cardinal signs. The Parkinson's life expectancy, again in the 30s and 1940s, was only 8 to 10 years. This is pre-levodopa. Levodopa wasn't introduced until about 1965. I'd like to show you a montage here of Adolf Hitler, and I point out his left hand. It's typically he's holding on to a belt, or he's holding on to gloves, or a scroll of papers. And this is a Parkinson's trick that I saw frequently by my patients. A patient with Parkinson can suppress the tremor simply by manipulating something in their hands. Oftentimes it's a coin, it can be gloves, anything else. So what he was doing in these pictures, I think, was largely suppressing his hand tremor. I might share one brief example of a well-known neurosurgeon at the Mayo Clinic who had Parkinson's disease, and he had very bad tremor. And he would be in operation, he'd go down just about to make an incision, and his tremor would stop. He would make his incision, pull back, and start tremoring violently again. I don't want him operating on me, but at the time it does point out clearly that the tremor is under some volitional control, at least in the earlier stages of the disease. This is a montage we put together of his signatures. This is when he was 34. This is his normal signature. You notice after the first letter of his name, the other letters are roughly the same size. I draw your attention to when he was 43. I think we can see here in 1933, at least it's arguable, that the letters have begun to diminish after he makes his initial letters. Certainly by 34, gets very small. And as we walk through his signature over the years, age 50, here age 53, it's virtually unintelligible till finally, shortly before his death, it just looks like chicken scratching. So micrographia was a prominent feature for Adolf Hitler. How frustrating that must have been for him. His staff was well aware of his Parkinson's symptoms. There are many reports describe his tremor, his inability to sign a document without putting his hand down, resting his hand, and then quickly scratching off on a flourish, or describing his tremor of his hands, or his slowness of movement, or the hoarseness of his voice. the Nazi censors were very good to keep the population from being aware of his Parkinson's disease, and they censored the videotapes very carefully. You may be aware the last couple of years he was alive, he rarely gave any presentations himself orally. Goebbels gave most of the propaganda speeches at that point. I imagine in this picture, his hand was probably tremoring like crazy, and these different staff were looking at it, but of course, this is a still picture, and I don't know that for a fact. I'd like to move on now to some behavioral changes, and this comes from our own research, but others have found this as well. There are behavioral changes in patients with advanced Parkinson's disease. Most commonly, it occurs with concept formation and sequence planning and shifting, maintaining sets. What I really mean by that, in layman's language, is people with chronic Parkinson's have trouble shifting from one thought to the next. Essentially, they become sticky. They become mentally inflexible. They have trouble breaking away from old ideas and forming newer ideas. Now, they're not demented, and people around them won't suggest that they're demented, but this is a significant neuropsychological syndrome that impairs the behavior of people with advanced Parkinson's disease. But oftentimes it takes neuropsychological testing to document. About this time, Hitler's drug use was also increasing. During Dr. Morell's service to Adolf Hitler, of course, Morell, people are familiar with him. He was quite controversial. He was a general physician. He had no real experience in cardiac disease or neurological disease, but he made Hitler happy. He tried a lot of different medicines. He wanted to be shown as doing something. And among those medicines that he prescribed were methamphetamine, oxycodone, barbiturates, and cocaine. He had no appreciation for interaction of medications. His usage of so much medication is known as polypharmacy, and undoubtedly had a number of drug and drug-drug interactions. Oftentimes, the staff noticed Hitler's optimism, and he seemed so euphoric that he must have some secrets tucked under the sleeve of his tunic. But indeed, I suspect what he had was a drug-induced euphoria. Well, now let's pass on knowing something about these illnesses and see if we might be able to apply those medical factors to three major military battles. There have been historical arguments for and against Operation Barbarossa beginning in 1941, and you're probably familiar with these. Stalin had purged the Soviet officer corps in April and May of 1941. No doubt this reduced the effectiveness of the Red Army. That was a reason for attacking early. Access to raw materials from the Soviet Union was diminishing, and yet Germany needed those raw materials. And they were concerned about whether or not they'd be able to obtain them later. And the United States began to rearm and assist Great Britain. Now, I think those are all valid reasons, but there are also some reasons that are against attacking in 1941. Incomplete stockpiles of German conventional weapons that didn't even have their personnel ranks filled out. Certainly the qualitatively superior Wonder weapons were not yet available, of course, referring to the V-1 and V-2 rockets, sound-activated torpedoes, Me-261 jet fighters, and Arado Blitz jet bombers. There were also plans to increase the rail system, including broad gauge megatrains, the Breitspurbahn, and that was not yet available and wasn't going to be made available. I think the arguments against beginning the invasion of the Soviet Union in May of 1941, or I'm sorry, June of 1941, are stronger than those for beginning it, especially when we consider that Adolf Hitler, had he delayed several years to say 1943 or 1944, he would have been near or beyond his predicted life expectancy for both coronary artery disease and Parkinson's disease. Now, they may not have understood those diseases well, but the doctors in Germany knew the life expectancy of those disorders. And they would have let Hitler would have demanded to know that, I'm convinced. A coronary artery disease and Parkinson's disease therefore served as medical imperatives, in my argument, that hastened this invasion of the Soviet Union. Also, we have to keep in mind that Hitler showed megalomania. And in his belief, he had to be alive to lead Germany to victory. He felt, and said this frequently, no one else could achieve it except him, and he needed to achieve his dual goals, which was Lebensraum, and deal decidedly with what he called the Jewish question. Operation Barbarossa in 1941. You're familiar with that, I'm sure. There were originally two goals that Hitler designed. One was to take Leningrad. The second one was to go into the Ukraine area and then circle on down to the petroleum fields. Hitler's plan was to starve the Soviet Union of food and fuel. And he thought Moscow did not need to fall, that the Soviet Union would fall with that. There was another argument to be made by his generals that violently disagreed with him. And von Clausewitz would have said, you need to take the enemy's capital, which was what both General Franz Halder, head of the Army High Command, argued for strenuously, as did Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. And they argued vehemently and somewhat uncharacteristically of Adolf Hitler. He actually accepted their argument, but rather than cancel what his plans were originally, he simply added the attack on Moscow. And at that point, made it into an attack along an 1,800-mile front with his 4 million German troops. These three thrusts simultaneously were beyond the capability, of course, of the German forces. In addition, 3 months into the Operation Barbarossa, at a critical operational time, Adolf Hitler suffered a severe bout of bacterial dysentery. This was probably a bacterial dysentery. We're not sure what type it was, but this occurred in August of 1941. And perhaps because of his long history of much more benign GI problems, it hit him very, very hard. And he was incapacitated for about a month. He wasn't able to go to any of the planning meetings. He had let it be known by those closest to him that he was going to cancel the attack on Moscow and just go with his original plan. But when this bacterial dysentery hit, followed by a severe gallbladder attack in September of 1941, both prostrated him. He was not able to attend the meetings, and as a result, all three tangents went forward. So in addition to his encirclement strategy, they attacked Moscow. We know he got to the outskirts of Moscow. As Steve was talking earlier, when I was in Moscow, I went out to the marker where the German troops got to, and it was easily within view of Moscow. It's very close. So the expansion of military objectives overextended the German capabilities and doomed Operation Barbarossa to failure. I think there were some behavioral and medical influences in Operation Barbarossa. We've mentioned Adolf Hitler's megalomania and his mental inflexibility, which was really lifelong. He was very stubborn. He scapegoated on his generals. Even when he made the mistakes, he would blame his generals for it. I've mentioned the acute GI illnesses, the dysentery and the gallbladder attack. And coincident with this, he was taking more and more drugs prescribed by Theodore Morel. As things got worse and worse, Morel prescribed more and more shots. General Friedrich Paulus was, of course, the general in charge of the forces, German forces at Stalingrad. Paulus wanted to surrender, and Hitler exploded, said he could never do that. No field marshal or no general could do that. So Hitler elevated him to field marshal, thinking that he would either keep fighting or commit suicide. Paulus surrendered, and he said he refused to kill himself for what he called that little corporal. Passing on now to the Battle of Normandy, June 6, 1944. This was probably taken picture on June 7th, June 8th. Of course, all of the equipment coming ashore. And just refresh our memories about the location of the various beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. The 6 beaches, and Omaha had a desperate time trying to get ashore. Erwin Rommel correctly predicted that Normandy was going to be the site of the invasion. Hitler overrode him, believing the Allied deceptions that were ongoing, the misinformation that Normandy was merely a feint. And they particularly were suspect of Pas-de-Calais as the site of the invasion, but there were many other sites. Hitler's mental inflexibility of his advanced Parkinson's, along with his lifelong stubbornness, inability to admit his mistakes, he clung to the false beliefs far longer than normal. It was almost a full 48 hours before there was any meaningful counterattack, because he had many of the panzers at Pas-de-Calais. Some were held back well into France. Had they attacked Omaha Beach the first day, almost certainly they could have driven the Americans back into the sea. With this, the Second Front was established, ultimately leading to Germany's defeat. This is Pas-de-Calais here, just across from Dover. It was a logical place to expect the attack, as opposed to down here along the beaches of Normandy. Of course, Patton's Phantom Army was over here near Dover. Winston Churchill's triumph and tragedy attributed Hitler's slowness to respond at Normandy solely to the carefully orchestrated Allied deceptions, and no doubt those proved significant. His Phantom Army and the Allied misinformation played substantial roles. But in addition, I suggest there was a neurological explanation in that Hitler's slowness to respond resulted from his mental inflexibility, his inability to get rid of the idea of this being a feint becoming the site of the invasion, his diminished executive function due to his advanced Parkinson's disease melded with his lifelong stubbornness. These factors, along with the well-sold misinformation, led to his indecisive leadership. Moving on then to the third battle, the Battle of the Bulge, the last great battle of World War II, began December 16, 1944, and ended January 25, 1945. This, of course, was a surprise Ardennes offensive designed to divide the Allied armies, to capture Allied fuel dumps because the Germans were out of fuel essentially at this point, and to capture Antwerp. They thought by so doing that they'd be able to get separate peace with the US and Great Britain and Canada. It was a risky gamble. The generals never fully endorsed this plan, which Hitler took months and months to put together. It was extremely risky, and obviously, unfortunately, it didn't work. Rather complicated slide, but only to show you that here's Bastogne, completely surrounded by Nazi troops. Well, this has a mind of its own. And that 101st Airborne was defending Bastogne. They defended it long enough for Patton's army to disengage, travel to Bastogne, and save them. However, the people in the in the 101st Airborne didn't think they needed to be saved by anybody because they were used to being surrounded. I thought that was rather a nice comment. Well, the next slide is Anthony McAuliffe, who is, of course, the commander of the 101st Airborne. And he was quite well known for his statement when asked to surrender by the German forces. He responded by nuts, writing that. And the colonel that took the message to the German headquarters was asked, "What in the world does nuts mean?" And he informed the Germans that Anthony McAuliffe didn't curse, but in plain English, it meant go to hell. And so with that, they knew that they were not going to give up, and the battle went forward. I think for reasons I'm not quite sure, this is not going to go forward any longer, despite any of my attempts. So it was only about 3 months later that the war was over. Of course, Berlin was taken. And with that, I just wanted to share a couple of final thoughts.
Tom, you could always hit escape and then go to your slides individually and click on them if you're not able to have the mouse advance, if you have more slides.
Yeah, well, there's not much more, and actually even hitting my escape, Rich, will not let me get out of this. So I think
All right.
I'm not sure why this is, so I'm going to stop sharing at this point and just conclude this with a couple of final observations. It's often wondered why the German nation, that was quite sophisticated, quite advanced scientifically, would fall for Adolf Hitler, his shtick. And I'm going to read something from my book that I think describes it about as well as I can describe it. Hitler's charismatic behavior shone forth at a time when such grandiosity and radicalism appealed to desperate, war-weary, and recession-suffering Germans who longed for overly simplistic answers and an easy scapegoat to blame for their discomfort. After all, post-World War I Germany politically was a boiling cauldron, steeped in revolutionary zeal, suffering from national disgrace and humiliation, and brimming with utter indignation. The German nation proved ripe for a demagogue who campaigned on the promise to make Germany great again. I wish I could advance this last slide, but so I think that maybe just with that conclusion, with one final thought I want to share, and I never want to give a talk on my book without mentioning this. The question may come up periodically: did Hitler's illnesses in any way mitigate his guilt? And the answer is overwhelmingly no. His anti-Semitism, his behaviors, genocidal behaviors, all of these were formed years before he became ill. And so if anything, his illnesses merely made it harder for him to accomplish what his goals were that were formed decades before he began World War II. So I want to make sure, and this is something that has been bothering the historians, and they're very afraid to talk about his health for fear that this might be misinterpreted. And I don't think this needs to be misinterpreted, because his health in no way brought about his awful behavior. With that, I would be pleased to stop. And should there be questions, I'd be pleased to try to answer them.
Well, Tom, I'll kick off with one. Where did you ever get EKGs of Adolf Hitler? How did you get access to that?
They exist. They're in some very old books and records, medical records that I was able to obtain.
Wow, that's impressive. And when you said he was born, you said on his birth certificate it said Hitler, not Schicklgruber?
That's right. It was Hitler by that time. They changed the name from Schicklgruber.
Okay. because I just started, but I haven't gotten too far on a book called I Was Hitler's Doctor by, yeah, what's the guy's name? Hold on, I'll get the name. And he mentions how Kurt Kruger, I guess he was the doctor right before Morell, and he talks about how Hitler first came to him and introduced himself as Schicklgruber. So I just found it curious.
Yeah, that's an interesting, and I go into that at some depth in my book. There was the Schicklgrubers, and then the name got changed because they weren't sure of his grandfather's parentage. In fact, as you know, there was a belief that he was a Jewish man. And so they finally got enough witnesses to come in, and it was actually not Hitler, but it got shortened to Hitler. And that's what he continued to go after he left the Schicklgruber behind. It's kind of complicated. I can't remember all the details, quite frankly.
He's got a convoluted family tree for sure.
It's a very
People have questions, you can unmute yourself and ask. So by all means, feel free to. And I'll have another question. Is it possible, or do you see any evidence of amphetamine causing any Parkinsonian-like tremors in him, or any amphetamine psychosis?
Amphetamines have a different type of tremor. They do not cause a typical Parkinson's flexion extension 3 to 5 cycles per second tremor. What it causes is a very rapid tremor. And if you've gone sleepless for a couple of days, you drink too much coffee, you have that very rapid tremor. It's an essential tremor or senile tremor, but it doesn't look at all, it's much faster, it's like 20 cycles per second. It doesn't look at all like a typical Parkinson's tremor, at least to a neurologist. Okay. So it would not have caused that. Did the amphetamine give rise to unusual behaviors? Well, certainly it was very alerting for him. There are many examples of where he was essentially almost asleep, only to have Morell inject him with a substance. It might have been methamphetamine. Sometimes it was eupavarin, which was oxycodone, essentially. And he would just go through a metamorphosis, and he would wake up and he was much, much better. And he couldn't live without those after a while. He would not let Morell go because he did him so much good. I don't think psychosis, I could never convince myself, Rich, that he had psychosis. He was somewhat delusional, but it was delusional in that he would believe something far beyond what facts would support. And he simply was convinced of it, but it really wasn't the truth. It wasn't factual. But that's a sort of delusion that is different from the psychotic delusion where he thinks he's being killed or whatever. And that's a different type of delusion.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Otherwise,
this may well be outside the scope of your research, but methamphetamine and indeed cocaine were key components for the Panzer, the Luftwaffe divisions. They were used heavily throughout the Wehrmacht, all through the war. So my question is, was Hitler's use normalized because of that? Was it aberrant and hidden, or was it simply unknown by the general staff and the people who were around him?
It's a good point. Obviously, the Panzers, the rapid advances that they made, methamphetamine driven, they didn't sleep for days. So it was somewhat normalized. Hitler was able to get hold of that. And it was analyzed in the laboratory and shown to be methamphetamine, so that it was somewhat normalized in those days. They really didn't know some of the side effects that came with chronic usage of methamphetamines. Likewise with cocaine. It was actually an ear, nose, and throat doctor who started him on cocaine following the explosion. They tried to blow him up in July of 1944. And so he liked that and was continued on that, unbeknownst at the time to Morell, who was giving him methamphetamine and oxycodone, Eucodal, that they called it at the time. So I think that some of it was unknown, but at the same time, Morell was very much aware of the habit-forming nature of this. He tried, for example, to give you Eucodal, which was OxyContin, no more than every other day, because he knew the habit forming, this queen of remedies, as they called it in the day. But Hitler didn't stand for that. He demanded it more often.
Was Hitler right-handed or was he ambidextrous?
He was right-handed.
What makes you think he was ambidextrous, Mark?
Well, the artist side of things, and so I was just curious if he had some right brain tendencies. One comment about the Mayo Clinic neurosurgeon. I think a person with early Parkinson's disease would still be a fine surgeon, because a Parkinson's tremor is a resting tremor. The second they begin to move, the tremor goes away. So I would imagine that Mayo Clinic surgeon was probably a good surgeon until he had advanced Parkinson's disease.
He practiced for many years. That's a good point.
If we extend your analysis to, and this is probably outside the realm here of your book, to his generals, general staff, and people he interacted with, did any of them have medical problems that interacted with Hitler and made decisions worse or better?
I can't answer that. I haven't studied them in any depth in terms of their medical histories. I'm not aware of it from the principles that I interacted with Adolf Hitler, but they may well have had some problems. It's curious that if you look at the principles in World War II, Steve LeMay, who I know has spoken to you about FDR and his illnesses. Stalin was diagnosed as a clinical paranoid, and truly was paranoid. And Winston Churchill, of course, was alcoholic. So that all four had their own medical problems coming together. It seemed like at some point there needs to be some coalescence of the studies of these four gentlemen and see how that meshed together.
Thank you.
If there are no more questions, are there any more questions?
I was going to say, great talk, Tom.
Thank
Could I
you.
go with just one more?
Of course.
So after July 44th, Stauffenberg plot, there was apparently a noticeable deterioration in Hitler's physical condition, the tremors, his ability to stand, a lot of factors. In your research, did you feel that that was indeed an outcome of the bomb going off, or was it an outcome of his general physical disability just accelerating?
It's very interesting question. And what I can share is that, of course, the bomb itself left him with literally hundreds of splinters throughout his body. And he received injections of Eucodal in order to have those taken out. Interesting enough, though, his Parkinson's disease got better, described as being substantially better for at least a period of time. And sometimes great excitement will actually bring about an improvement in the Parkinson's symptoms and signs. I don't know how long that lasted, but there was mention of that made in some of the historical records.
Thank you.
If there's no more questions, I'll wrap this up, and I want to thank Dr. Hutton for a really interesting and marvelous talk. And thank you all for joining us, and I'll stay tuned for the next lecture. I'll be emailing that in a little bit. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Hutton.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.
Thank you very much and good evening.
Thank you.